Generation Alpha does not exist. Or does it? Don't you love when people do that? They make these really controversial, like, grab you, clickbaity titles, and then when you actually get into the video, it's not really that controversial. It's just kind of whatever. That's kind of what this video is, but I think you'll find it interesting because there has been a pet peeve. I used to make generation videos. It's got to be like, what was it, 2016, 2017? It was based on an article that I wrote in 2015, so 10 years ago, talking about generations and critiquing the way they were generally understood. But a lot of has happened since then, obviously. The world actually went pretty crazy since then. So I wanted to post a new video. You don't have to watch the old ones. I'm going to try to summarize everything in this and present a new argument about why I don't think Generation Alpha really exists yet. But maybe it does. There we go. So here we go. So here's the mainstream generation birth years. Baby boomers, 1946 to 1964. This is what the mainstream generally understands. Most people, when they think of the years that these generations were born, this is pretty much what most people think. Not everyone agrees on the details, but it's pretty close to this. Generation X, 1965 to 1980. Millennials, 1981 to 1996. Gen Z, 1997 to 2012. And Generation Alpha, 2013 to present. So if you notice, like 1946 to 1964, that's 18 years. 1965 to 1980, that's 15. 81 to 96, I guess we're about 15 years. So the generations are pretty short, 15 years. Because normally when you think of a generation, like the original idea of generations was that it was the parents were in one generation and the children were in the next and their children were in the next generation. That's the traditional understanding of generations. When they started putting them to these cohort groups, they had to actually select actual years. But you would think they would be like 20 years because, right, it takes 20 years for a child to grow into an adult. So why would it be short? Wouldn't you think it'd be the opposite? Don't you think the generations would be getting longer because we're having kids at older ages now? Like we're not having kids at 13 anymore. You know, it's like most of us are having kids maybe in our 30s now. So you'd think the generations would get longer, not these short 15-year things. But where do these dates even come from? Like, why these dates? It mostly comes from Pew Research Center. And that was a 2019 standardization for studies. And it was based primarily on tech milestones. Like, you know, this is the internet generation. This is the iPhone generation. And now we're entering the AI generation or whatever. But even Pew Research admits that these labels are convenient, but they're not always the best. And they're actually trying to move away from it. What I prefer are the Strauss and Howe dates. Now, who are Strauss and Howe? Strauss and Howe actually were the demographers, historians that defined what generations are. Like the idea of cohort root generations existed before Strauss and Howe. Like there was always the baby boomers, and like that was a thing that was talked about way back when the baby boomers were being born, because they seemed to have a generational personality all their own. But Strauss and Howe kind of solidified it into like kind of a soft science. Originally in their 1990 book titled Generations, and updated again in 1997 in the book The Fourth Turning. Now, Strauss died in 2007, but Neil Howe is continuing to write books on this topic. His most recent one was The Fourth Turning is Here in 2023. And of course, I didn't talk about that book because it hadn't been written yet in my older videos about the subject. But we'll talk a little bit about it here. But first, I just want to go over the theory. So basically, their idea of generations is based on repeating cycles of history. These cycles last roughly 80 to 100 years. There are some cycles that are shorter. There are some cycles that are longer than 100 years. I think there was one cycle that was only 67 years, the Civil War cycle. I have some issues with that as well, but I'm not going to talk about that in that video. I already talked about that in my part 3 of the critique of Strauss and Howe Generational Theory video. But I don't want to digress too much about that. So generations, they're usually about 20 years long based on them, which seems more realistic to me. Shorter generations are uncommon because most parents don't have kids until they're in their 20s or older. But it's also based on these 4 turnings. Just ignore these numbers. I don't know why I pasted it in and put those numbers in for some reason. But the high is actually the first turning, not the 4th. It's the spring. There's unity, conformity. The last example of a high was the 1950s, post-World War II. Then the second turning is an awakening. That's the summer. Rebellion, freedom, 1960s counterculture. The third turning is the unraveling. This is the fall, more individualism, fragmentation. So these are like the 80s, 90s, culture wars, rising inequality. And then the crisis period is like the winter. Upheaval, institutions destroyed, institutions rebuilt, which is kind of what we're seeing right now because we're in a 4th turning. And based on these turnings, these turnings basically determine the generations. And there's these repeating archetypes that occur throughout history. The first is the prophet. They enter childhood during a high, and they rebel as young adults in an awakening. The most recent example is the baby boomers, born 1943 to 1960. Notice it ends 1960 in Strauss and Howe, not 1964. Nomad is the next. They're the reactive generation. They enter childhood during an awakening, and they're the cynical survivors who navigate the unraveling. Generation X is the most recent example, 1961 to 1981. And then Hero Civic, they enter childhood during an unraveling. They unite to fix the crisis. They're millennials is the most recent example, 1982 to 2005. Look how late it ends. We're going to talk a little bit about that. 1982 to 2005. And then Artist Adaptive, they enter childhood during a crisis. They smooth things over in the next high. Originally, Strauss and Howe referred to them as the Homeland Generation, the most recent version. But their name has kind of become more generally understood as Gen Z, and they've adopted that. And they were born 2006 to 2029. All right, right there. So 2029 is the future. So Generation Z is still being born now. There is no Generation Alpha, according to Strauss and Howe. They're not. Generation Alpha does not exist yet. So I just want to show you this chart. This is from the Wikipedia page. I actually updated this Wikipedia way back when I was making my Civil War video to have these extra columns here, and it looks like it's held up pretty well, and other people have updated it since then. But look how far back their cycles go with their study. They go all the way back to 1433 with the Arthurian generation, and you can see these archetypes are repeating throughout history. These are the birth year spans, and these are the turning year spans. If you notice, the birth year spans are different from the turning year spans, usually a few years before the turning year spans. And the reason for this is because the generations, the generation birth years aren't based on when the current generation that's being born is entering childhood. It's actually based on when the previous generation comes of age. It's based on these triggering events that signal the end of one turning and the other. It's like a turning point event. For example, when the baby boom generation were coming of age, the turning point event was the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which happened in 1963. So if you notice, the turning year span here was, they actually got this wrong. It should have been 63, but they put 64. But yeah, basically 1963 was the turning point. So that was the end of the first turning, the beginning of the second turning. And why that's important is that that was when the oldest members of the baby boom generation were coming of age. So yeah, they were entering adulthood at that point. And so that event, even though most of the baby boomers were still kids during that time, that event had an impact on them, much more so than Generation X, who the oldest members of them were maybe 1 or 2 years old. So they probably have very little memory of what life was like before the JFK assassination during a first turning. So they don't have a memory of the mood of the country back then, whereas the baby boom generation does. They remember what life was like before JFK was assassinated and we got thrust into a second turning. And there's been several of those. I think the next one was Reagan's Morning in America in 1984. That was the turning point for the nomad generation coming of age. And then the next one was the 2008 financial crisis. So that's why it says 2008 to 2033. That was the turning point for the millennial generation coming of age. And we haven't really reached the turning point for the homeland generation to come of age yet, because it's still ongoing. In fact, here it says 2033, which is really far in the future. So yeah, that's basically how they structured their generations and why they used the dates they did. And I think it's actually, they have better reasoning than I'm explaining in their books. But I prefer their reasoning than what Pew Research is using, so which is why I prefer their dates, although I do disagree with some of the specifics. But the general idea of why these dates exist, I tend to prefer Strauss and Howe. So one thing that they point out in their books is certain trends that change. Like one of the things they point out is the way gender roles are changing during these different turnings. And another thing they talk about is the way kids are parented. I'm not going to talk about all the things because there's a long list of things that they talk about that for trends. You'll have to read the books for those details. But the parenting trends, I think, is probably the most important one, because it most directly affects the cycles and the way generations the way their generation personalities become as they enter adulthood. So the first turning, the prophet kids, they're indulged, they're seen as spoiled. If you look in popular media, to see at the time, to see the way kids were depicted, you'll remember Veruca Salt, the spoiled brat from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, or Dennis the Menace, who's like a troublemaking kid. The kids they're still kids. Like we're not treating them like they're horrible. Like, but it's starting to, the negative depiction of kids is beginning. It peaks though in a second turning. So this is when freedom peaks. Nomad kids are neglected. They're viewed as troublesome, evil. So you could think like Rosemary's Baby, Damien, these movies that came out, these evil children, these devil children. And also even though Strauss and Howe don't talk about this, I like to talk about Pinocchio, because Pinocchio, the book was published in 1883. This was, if you look at the chart here, 1883, that was like right at the end of, 1883, right at the beginning of the lost generation. So the missionary generation, who were the prophets, were just starting to enter adulthood at this time, and the nomads were just starting to be born in 1883. So it was not fully negative yet, but it was entering that kids are evil phase. And if you read the book Pinocchio, not the cartoon, if you read the book, Pinocchio is depicted as a bad kid, and he suffers some really harsh consequences for his behavior. Like he gets hanged, his feet get burned off. There's a lot of horrible things that happen to him. One thing I forgot to mention that I wanted to point out was that in the Pinocchio book, Pinocchio actually kills Jiminy Cricket. See that blood splatter? That's a Jiminy Cricket. He threw him against a wall in the book. So third turning, unraveling, protection increases. So I was a kid during the unraveling because I was born in 1979. So I'm like very tail end of Generation X. But I remember I remember what life was like in the early 80s when there was a lot more freedom and kids could just go off and do whatever they wanted. And I remember riding bikes without a helmet when I was learning how to ride a bike. And then all of a sudden, when I was 13, suddenly I had to wear a helmet. I was like, what the hell is this? I'm like, I've been riding for years. Why do I have to ride a helmet? And I remember them closing the campus in our school because I remember my older sisters, they had an open campus and they could do all sorts of fun things and they could leave and go to Taco Bell and stuff during lunch. But me, no, campus was closed. We couldn't leave. There was like teachers guarding every exit. It just became a lot more restrictive. But it was because protection was increasing. It was a third turning and there was increased protection of kids. Now this peaks with helicopter parenting for the artist kids in the fourth turning. So one thing I want to point out here is the nomads, they're kind of the parents of the artist kids. I mean, artist kids are raised by a combination of nomads and hero, so basically Generation X and Millennial are the parents of Gen Z, a combination of the two. But the nomads tend to be the ones that set the tone for it, and they're kind of compensating for how neglected they were when they were young. Oops. And so they kind of overcompensate and they overprotect their kids. And that's where the helicopter parenting comes from. And then as the artists grow up, they remembered how suffocated they were as kids. And they kind of go the opposite direction. And that's why they wind up neglecting their kids, who are the nomads. They set the tone for the way nomads are being raised. So that's kind of why you see these cycles repeating themselves, is that the parents of one generation are compensating for the mistakes of the parents of the previous generation. And that's why I like Pinocchio is such a great example, because the book is the way it depicts kids is so dark compared to the Disney movie. Like the book blames the kid, but the movie sympathized with Pinocchio as the victim. Like Pinocchio's, if you watch the cartoon, and especially the remake of the cartoon, which also came out during a fourth turning, both the Disney cartoon and the live action remake came out during two different fourth turnings. The fourth Disney movie came out in 1940 during the last fourth turning, the Great Depression and World War II fourth turning, and the live action remake came out in I guess 2023. I forget what year, but it was during our fourth turning that we're currently going through, and it basically shows Pinocchio as just being kind of a victim of these evil adults who are trying to take advantage of him, and he's always trying to be the good kid. And especially the live action remake, it's even more sympathetic of Pinocchio than the cartoon that came out in 1940. And when you compare it to the book, and you just see how bad a kid Pinocchio is and how harshly he gets punished, like the consequences of his actions are pretty dark. It's just a way. It's just, I talk about these, I was talking about all these movies, Rosemary's Baby and Damien, and because the way kids are depicted in popular culture is kind of a reflection of how they were actually raised. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much on that topic, but I think it's something to be aware of when we're talking about this. So let's get back to the dates. So S&H, they're grounded in historical events. So like I was talking about those turning points. I think the turning point for the prior fourth turning was the stock market crash of 1929, Black Friday. So when we compare the dates, the boomers are pretty close, right? It's, what was it, 1943 to 1960. It extends to 64 in the Pew Research, but it's not too far off. 18 years. So now 18 years, it's shorter than 20 years, but remember, there were a lot of baby boomers being born. That's why it was called the baby boom generation. So it's a pretty big generation, even though the year span is shorter than 20 years. Now, 13th generation, this is Generation X. They actually referred to Generation X as the 13 generation because it's the 13th generation if you count down from the Awakening generation, which was the oldest generation. They were the elders during the Revolutionary War, where America was founded. So they're considered the 13th generation. But why do they get a number and no one else does? And I think Strauss and Howe mentioned that 13 is an unlucky number, and nomad generations tend to be unlucky because they enter what should be their peak earning years during a fourth turning, which is usually a huge economic downturn, like a depression or a huge recession, or there's a major total war. And so basically what should have been their peak earning years winds up getting destroyed, and a lot of them don't even make it out of the fourth turning. The ones that do make it to the first turning, in which a lot of those problems are addressed, and it's usually first turning is usually good times for the winners of the war, really bad times for the losers of the war, but the winners usually benefit from the changes that were made, except for the 13th generation, because by then a lot of them they're entering elderhood, so that they kind of miss the boat. When you look at the lost generation, they didn't really benefit from all the entitlements that the GI generation got after World War II. They didn't, and a lot of them didn't even want it. They just, because a lot of them, they were like, oh, these are handouts, blah 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 blah. A lot of them were didn't agree with the concept of entitlements, and so they don't get it. And that's what a lot of people are saying is going to happen in Generation X. Like we're going to be the first generation that doesn't get Social Security. Like Social Security is going to be run out, and they'll probably have a solution for it, but we'll probably be too old to benefit from the solution. Same thing with aging. Like a lot of people think that we're going to cure aging. We're going to reach this. They call it the longevity escape velocity, in which we're curing the diseases and keeping ourselves of aging faster than we age, so we can just keep perpetually living. But a lot of people think that won't take hold until most of Generation X is probably dead. So we'll probably be the last generation to get old and die, and then maybe the next generations, they'll be able to live perpetually for however long. Of course, we don't know that for sure, but I'm just talking about the bad things that can happen to the 13th generation, because they're the unlucky generation. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much into that, but they extended to 1981, which is the same years that Pew Research says. Future James here. One thing I forgot to mention is that one of the things that Strauss and Howe pointed out was how generations tend to switch between leaning left and leaning right. So nomad and artists tend to be conservative or vote Republican, while the prophets and heroes tend to vote Democrat and be more, I guess, left-leaning or so. But I think this was observed going back to the Lost Generation, but I don't think they have. I haven't seen any data supporting it before the Lost Generation. But the Lost Generation was generally more conservative. GI Generation generally more Democrat. Silent voted mainly conservative. That's where the silent majority came from, by the way. Baby boom tended to vote Democrat, and Generation X tended to vote Republican. Millennial tended to vote Democrat. Now, Gen Z started off as Democrat, but we're seeing a big shift toward the right with them, so it looks like that pattern is holding. Anyway, I just wanted to add that because I thought it was interesting. The Millennial Generation, 1982 to 2005. Now, this is the big one. 2005, I think Pew Research said they ended in 1996. So then that would make the Homeland Generation, or the Generation Z, much younger than how we commonly view them then, because 2006 on, that's almost 10 years later than what Pew Research is saying Generation Z should be born. Now a lot of people who are proponents of Strauss and Howe theory agree more with the Pew Research dates, not because of because it's the commonly held belief, but because they believe that the turning point for our current fourth turning wasn't the 2008 financial crisis. It was actually 9/11, 2001, which would push back the beginning of the first turning quite a few years, to 2001 basically, and would mean that the kids entering childhood during our current first turning would be much older, would probably be born in the late 90s, which lines up a lot more closely to the Pew Research dates for Generation Z. But they don't agree that it would end in 2012. In fact, in the most recent book that Neil Howe wrote, The Fourth Turning is Here, he extended Generation Z to 2029. So yeah, there's no Generation Alpha, according to Neil Howe. It's basically Generation Z is still being born to this day. Generation Alpha hasn't been born yet. They may not even be called Generation Alpha by Neil Howe. He might refer to them as something else. So there may never even be a Generation Alpha. So he believes that the fourth turning is going to keep going for like another 6 or so years into 2029, or 4 years if it goes to 2029. When he wrote the book, I think it was 6 or 7 years away. But so yeah. Now, some people think that we're entering a golden age, mostly conservatives, Trump supporters. If that's the case, then maybe the fourth turning is actually has already ended, and we're in a first turning already, or we will be in one very soon, maybe as soon as next year. If that's the case, then maybe Generation Alpha is already being born. Maybe they've been born for the last couple years. Me personally, I believe that Generation Alpha started being born around the time of the COVID pandemic, or the precursors to Generation Alpha. Because when you look at the previous cycle, right, you had the kids born during World War II, which started in 1939, right? A lot of people lump them in with the baby boomers, even though it doesn't really start till 1943. The war was still going on in 1943, right? So some baby boomers were born during World War II. Some baby boomers were actually being born during World War II. But the ones that were born slightly before, like Joe Biden, for example, he's actually silent generation. I think he was born in 41 or 42. So even though he often gets lumped in with the boomers, I think there's some similarities between people born at the end of one generation and the other. I call these cusps. And so this is the main thing I talk about when I was writing my article in 2015 about critiquing generational theory, is that I never liked the idea that generations flip on a dime, right? The example I always bring up is like, if you were born in 1981, that means you're Gen X. But if your best friend was born in 1982, he or she would be millennial. So you would be in different generations, even though you're only 1 year apart. And to make it even worse, let's say your parents were born in 1961. 1961 is still Generation X. So you'd be in the same generation as your parents if you were born in 1981. And your best friend who was born in 1982 would be in a different generation. And that just doesn't make sense. Like we can't hold that in our heads. And when you're younger, it's harder to, I think the reason why the generations are so short, according to Pew Research, is that when you're younger, it's harder to identify with someone much older than you, 20 years older than you. Like maybe 10 years you can identify with, but you go beyond that, 15, you're pushing it. As you get older, time compresses. time seems to move faster. I could identify much more easily with someone 20 years older than me now than I could when I was younger, because I've lived longer, and 20 years just doesn't seem as long to me. But I think a lot of people like when I see a lot of people arguing like, oh no, generation Alpha was born in 2010, not 2012. Anyone born after 2010 is nothing like Generation Z. But that's because they're young and they can't really relate to people much older than them or much younger than them. That's going to change when they get older, and it'll probably be easier to identify. But I still don't like the idea of this changing on a dime, because then you have this problem, right, where someone who's much closer in age with you is in a different generation. So what I did, and this was in the article that I wrote in 2015, and then I made a video about it in 2016 or 17. You can look back on my channel. It was to introduce these ideas of cusp cohort groups. So these are kind of smaller generations within the generation that kind of sit on the edges, basically. So it's a few years around these boundary years, basically. These 1942 to 43, 81 to 82, and I don't have specific years like, oh, it's 5 years before and 5. No, because the whole idea is that you're kind of gradually shifting to the other generation. So you'll see right near these cusping years, it's kind of equal, like where they're kind of half Generation X, half millennial. But as you get further, they get more and more millennial, but still have some Generation X traits until eventually it's just pure millennial, and then eventually it starts shifting into more Gen Z as they get closer to 2001 or 2008, if you believe the Strauss and Howe date. So these are cusping cohort groups. I even had names for them. I think Generation Jones was those born 1960 to 61, Generation Y, because Generation Y, 1981 to 1982, Generation Y was actually the original name for millennial. It was actually Strauss and Howe that coined the term millennial. But before that, they were referred to as Generation Y. And so that's why I consider the people born in the early part of millennial as Generation Y, which would be some Gen X. This would be my generation cusp, actually, because I was born in 79, pretty close to 81. Then Generation Z, 2005 to 2006. So if you were born around that time, close, then you'd be Generation Z. And then Homeland would be the actual main generation, because it's millennial homeland cusp. So this would actually make sense too. Like if let's say you don't believe that the fourth turning started with September 11th, then you would, and you actually believe 2008 is the beginning of the fourth turning, you could still extend Gen Z to earlier, before 2000. If you have the idea that Generation Z actually isn't a generation, it's a cusp between two generations, between millennial and homeland. So yeah, you could look at it that way. That's one solution to this problem, is to view these cusps as separate cohort groups that exist within the larger generations, and then you don't have to worry about this whole problem of the generations changing on a dime. It's transitioning gradually. So I don't know. This was a visual I was going to include, but didn't. I'm not going to show you my Tumblr. I'll put a link to my Tumblr post. This was the article I wrote in 2015. It was way back in the Tumblr days. I'll put in a link to it. I don't know if I agree with everything in that article anymore, because it was a long time ago that I wrote it. But I'll link it anyway. So yeah, I think did I skip anything here? Yeah. So the problem was Gen Z was too short, 15 years. It feels off. I want to talk about the crisis, though, peak, which is the crisis has 4 phases. I believe there's the triggering event, or I forget what word they call it. There's the thing that actually kicks off the crisis, whether it be September 11th or the 2008 financial crisis. That's up to you. And then there's a regeneracy in which people come together to try and come up with a solution to a problem. I think in our fourth turning, we had two regeneracies. We had Occupy Wall Street, and we had the Tea Party movement. If you are focusing on 2008 as being the crisis, if you're focusing on 2001 being the beginning of the crisis, then that would be a single regeneracy, because I think the whole country kind of united after 2001. So that was more of a uniting moment, which is another good argument for why 2001 might have been the triggering event and not 2008. But yeah, 2008 kind of split the country up into two factions. There was the Tea Party and the Occupy. Tea Party on the right, Occupy on the left, even though I'm holding my left hand for Tea Party and right hand for Occupy. But on your screen it's left and right, so it works out. And that's kind of what led to the divide of this country that we saw, the whole woke versus chud thing that we had going on in 2015 with Gamergate, and then Trump coming in, and just the mess, the political mess that we had a result in of division in politics, and the election issues, and I don't. You guys know, you guys lived through it. So, but I think that the final phase of this fourth turning, this crisis, is the climax. And for the previous fourth turning, that was World War II. For this fourth turning, I think it was COVID. I think COVID was our climax in 2020. And that's when you start to see the beginnings of the next generation, the prophets, even though I don't think the prophets were born in 2020. But think about the kids that were born during World War II and how they kind of had a lot in common with the older silents. I'm sorry, the younger silents and the older boomers had a lot in common with each other. And they tended to be, those were the ones, like when you think about all the 1960s rock bands that came out, like the Beatles and the Stones and Bob Dylan, and like a lot of these guys were war babies. They were born during a lot of them were silent generation, but they had a lot in common with the older boomers that were being born a few years later. But they kind of set the tone for that boomer second turning awakening period in the 60s. So I think what was I saying? I've lost track of what I was saying. I think that the climax for us was COVID, and that's when you started to see, like, the kids born during COVID are having. You're starting to see some major differences with them from the Gen Z kids that were born before COVID, and I think you're going to continue to see that as Gen Z morphs into this next generation Alpha, which might be starting to be born now, assuming Trump is right and we're entering a golden age, because that would mean that the fourth turning is ending and the first turning is beginning. So all the people that believe the golden age is beginning believe that the fourth turning is actually coming to an end. It's either already ended or it's very close to coming to an end, and because we're entering this golden age. And the first turning usually feels like that. In fact, I think one of them was referred to as the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was the first turning that occurred after the Civil War. Gilded Age, Reconstruction, Gilded Age. So it's it feels like if you come out as the victor, it's going to feel like a golden age. Think about how we felt after World War II, winning World War II, and the U.S. came out on top of the world, basically the world dominant power. For us, it was the 50s was kind of felt like a golden age. For Germany, probably didn't feel like a golden age to them. It probably felt pretty bad, even though eventually they put things together and came out okay. But yeah, which is why I think for the Democrats, it does not feel like a golden age. They do not. For them, it feels like we're in hell right now. For the Republicans, maybe it does feel like a golden age. So depending on who's correct, if we are entering a golden age, then Generation Alpha does indeed exist. Generation Alpha is being born right now. They just started being born maybe the last year or so. But if Strauss and Howe are what, if Neil Howe, Strauss is dead, Neil Howe is right, then this fourth turning is far from over. We've got maybe until 2023, and the Homeland Generation is still going to be being born well into 2029, and that's when we're going to start to see the shift to the next prophet generation being born is after 2029. So yeah, maybe Generation Alpha exists, maybe it doesn't. It depends on your worldview. I think we are nearing the end of the fourth turning. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think we're starting to see some major changes, some good ways, some bad ways. But I think it will lead to a new order going forward that we're starting to see the beginnings of. And while I wouldn't refer to it as a golden age, I think it's definitely a first turning that we're entering right now. So I do actually think Generation Alpha is being born. So there you go. I just completely reversed the title of this video. I brought that really aggressive, controversial, it's going to make people angry. What do you mean Generation Alpha does not exist? It exists, blah, blah, blah. And then I completely took back what I said because, but I did say it in the beginning, or does it? Because it does. I actually think Generation Alpha is just starting to be born now. I don't think Generation Alpha is as old as a lot of people think. I don't think it was 2012. I think it was maybe this year is when we're starting to see Generation Alpha being born. Anyway, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it wasn't too confusing. Trying to explain generational theory is a real challenge. I didn't really go through all these slides. I was going to go through a lot of this stuff, but I don't think I need to. But yeah. So if you want to learn more about it, if you want to hear about my ideas of the Civil War cycle and how it probably had a hero generation, even though Strauss and Howe said it didn't. Right here, you can check that video out. I'll post the link to that. But like I said, those videos were made a long time ago, so I don't even know if I agree with everything in them. But they're there, and I've been wanting to make this video for a while because the whole Generation Alpha thing has been annoying me. Every time I see people talking about it, it's like, no, Alpha was not born in 2012. Stop talking about that. But anyway, I probably didn't change anyone's mind about that, but maybe, All right, bye.